Hello, and welcome to the Contractpreneurship series, a podcast that delves into the world of contracting and provide insights to commercial and legal professionals on how to unlock value from contracts. Contractpreneurship is a concept I introduced to describe a particular approach and mindset in relation to contracts. It brings together the concept of an entrepreneur, a transformer, reimagining how things are done within the world of contracts. A contractpreneur is a transformer who reimagines how things are done along the contract lifecycle, thereby unlocking commercial value and driving real, sustainable and profitable growth. I'm Peggy Pauwels, and today you're listening to episode 2, focusing on the specific mindset required to value the importance of contracts and the role they should play within the entire business ecosystem. Welcome to another episode of Contractpreneurship. In the first episode of the podcast, we explored the importance of contracts, the value that they bring, how to unlock that value in contract negotiations, as well as once the contract's signed, post-signature, and the mindset that is required to really drive that value. Disciplines and principles that are important to all companies, all sizes, all industries and sectors that you are active in. At the time, I was joined by my good friend Tomas, and I'm delighted to welcome him again and found him willing to join today's podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Peggy. I was super surprised that you wanted me again after episode 1, but I'm super delighted to be here.
Fantastic. Well, Thomas, wij kennen elkaar van onze tijd in België, in BT, waar we samen hebben gewerkt. U maakte deel uit van mijn team in bid management. En het is een van de waarschijnlijk meest momenten waar ik meest trots op ben, is dat een jonge bidmanager kan doorgroeien en uiteindelijk ook CEO is geworden van BT Benelux, de regio. Dus fantastisch dat je hier bent en dat je bereid bent om jouw kennis en jouw ervaring met ons te delen.
Dankjewel.
Fantastic. All right. So, Thomas, I want to build on all the great insights that you shared in our last episode. Value was top of mind, and equally mindset, because it's one thing, you gave a fantastic example where you said, well, there needs to be a balance between the discipline and knowing what your contract stands for, holding each other to account, but then also understanding the value that when you achieve. You can't have one without the other, because just saying, oh, it's all about the value, you probably don't, deliver on the commercials of the contract. Thomas, help us understand the mindset that you need to truly unlock the value from contracts.
Yeah, Peggy, I think we ended quite nicely on the mindset piece, where I think in the last episode we were very much talking about contracting, managing contracts in life, and for me, mindset has very much to do with what's almost the culture that you create around it. Because we talked a lot about, does a contract manager do this properly, or a deal negotiator does it properly, or a lawyer that's in the deal room does it properly. But actually, a lot of the mindset is also driven by how in your organization, where you're sitting, wherever you are, how do you actually, in that whole cycle, take decisions as leaders? How do you actually support your teams to be able to do that? Because you can have a fantastic methodology, you can have fantastic discipline, you can talk about that value piece, but if the leaders don't, or the leadership and the culture in the company doesn't actually support and underpin that behavior, then actually you fairly quickly flip back into the very classical way, where you come into risk management in the very narrow sense of risk management, and you drive away from the value. And maybe to bring it a bit to life is, and I would almost, to the listeners or people who are listening, and I'm actually very excited to get other people's view as well, is that how do businesses take decisions, for example? How do you actually make a decision to do a contract? If you are in an environment, and very often you do a big partnership contract, so you have defines the value, and hopefully the people who have been kind of discussing and negotiating the contract understand the value. But the reality is that in a lot of organizations, the decision to contract is seen as a very tactical decision. So you in general have a legal person sitting there, an operational person sitting there, a finance person sitting, and the CEO who will take a decision. Yeah, do we contract? Yes or no? Where the question mark that you also again need to ask from at that moment in time: do we actually say yes to the contract for a common value understanding? It cannot be that a finance person in the business takes the decision to sign the contract for a completely opposite reason than what the business is doing or legal is doing. Because if you allow that to happen, then in execution, you never can actually help and empower your people to actually unlock the value and have that open mindset to contracts, if that makes sense.
Maybe an example might bring you to life, but I think what I'm hearing is it's that commitment up front, and that clarity is required up front to then almost, if I'm understanding you correctly, to give a mandate to those that manage the contract and the relationship in life to enable them and empower them to make real, good, sound commercial decisions. Is it, help us understand maybe with an example where you saw that it wasn't working?
Yeah, I think it look and it depends a bit in what area you look at. You have contracting, which happens, of course, fairly tactical as part of your normal business process. You have contracting where it's a bit more strategic, but still in the essence and the fundament of a contract remains the same. And I almost preach, do less contracts, but the ones you do, know why you do them for. And as a leader, and if I look back at my CEO role in the Benelux, for me, one of the key principles was, look, we need to drive a better outcome over a certain period of time. And that requires a certain level of discipline. And that means if you make a choice to do a contract, then stick to it, live to it. And actually, in every decision you take or every guide that you give to people afterwards, and stick to the reason why you took that decision. And very often you bring a contract to a contract sign-off governance type of conversation, and there is very opportunistically taken a decision because we can collect the order for that year, but people get distracted and the interest actually fades a little bit away after the event of the order is taken. And for me, it is super important, if you want to help and allow your people to thrive and actually be real contract leaders and entrepreneurs from that perspective, is actually that if you are the CEO that took the decision to do this, then be very, very consistent in helping and supporting those teams afterwards to help delivering that value that you wanted to get out of it. And in the Benelux, I've been doing it by, first of all, it's not about the volume of contracts you do, but it's about the ones you do, make sure you believe in it, that when you sign them, celebrate because you think it's a fantastic thing that you did and it's going to drive value. Really create that momentum and culture about we are, to some extent, selective in what we do, but if we do it, then we are all behind it and then we all go for it. For me, to the previous conversation where we very much talk about the process itself, the whole sequence, if we fix that, then still we need to fix also that leadership component, because if you don't marry those things up, then you flip very quickly back into old type of behavior. Does that make sense?
I think you touched on it previously, is that contracting tends to be quite transactional and in the moment, whereas what you're highlighting is actually the contract is an articulation of a relationship, an engagement, right? A commitment that you're making or preparing to make. So be very mindful almost about what that represents. I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it. I have to say to Thomas, I don't think companies look at their contracts in that way.
No, I do fully agree. So the reality is that this is a super difficult thing to solve, and I also don't. I also don't think there is a magic solution to it. I think it's all about awareness. Is a leader willing to be aware, and then the change will happen. And I don't believe it's about kind of I'm going to drive a program to solve this in the next 3 months, because that's culture in general is a much bigger thing. But if you're mindful about how effective and how powerful it can be, if you switch and think differently about it, then the whole outcome will be better. I'm a strong believer of it, and it sounds maybe not very tangible, but it becomes very tangible if you start implementing and driving it. I was in that time running the Benelux region, surprised actually being part of a large corporate, surprised actually how in a few years' time running that region, how you can turn actually the value around, where I was always convinced, look, we are in an infrastructure business. Yeah, look, the revenue and the margin is almost predictable at the start of the year, that type of environment, but the reality is not true. Value is always out there, but you need to be willing to go for it, and it needs that consistency in culture and leadership.
I think it's such a powerful message that you're giving, and a lot of companies, I think, and teams are only just starting and embarking on the journey of putting contracts and placing them central to their processes, let alone, look at them in the way that you're describing. But there is something there, isn't there, about what we see in other parts of like HR, people change, sales, whatever it is. If you're deliberate, if you're very focused by, in putting something central to your organization, that's where it starts, I think. Yeah. And then you drive your actions and your decision making accordingly.
Yeah, and it comes again down, and I think, and it sounds like repetitive, but it comes down to, do I understand what the value is? Do I understand why I do it? Always there to, and it has nothing to do with contracts, but in my own career development, if I kind of think to talk about another aha moment, but there's a much more, at a certain moment in my career, was doing a deal-making type of role, and my job was not very clearly defined. Look, and you know me, that's very tough for me. I kind of want to understand what I actually need to do. And instead of, I allowed myself for a certain period of time to be fairly frustrated about it, but actually by turning the question around and actually start thinking, okay, but instead of thinking that my role defines what I need to do, is for yourself, start to understand in which situation do I deliver value, and that means that being adaptive to the situation is actually a fundamental thing. That doesn't mean that in every situation you will deliver value in the same way, but the moment you start doing it, that the value explodes to a certain extent, and it sounds like, okay, it's something to do with contracting, but actually it is very similar, because the job description you have is also kind of a contract to a certain extent, and if you start thinking in that way, and if you start reflecting as an individual on how you perform and how you lead, because all people who are performing in contracts are leaders to a certain extent. If you start questioning yourself and driving that value conversation, then the value out there is almost unlimited, if that makes sense.
And that must appeal to businesses out there, right? In terms of value and personal value as well, in terms of job satisfaction and how you go about it.
Yeah.
I think what is, because people listening might think, oh my God, that's almost a philosophical debate. But if I may, I think I want to apply your thoughts to something quite more tangible, and maybe linking it back to, our previous discussion. But I remember in my own experience where, there was, any organization will probably go through some phase or another where the business teams get frustrated about, the time it takes for contracts, to conclude, and the process is frustrating, and why do the lawyers take so much time, et cetera, et cetera. So, and quite often, you hear, oh my God, the problem is the contracts. The problem is the piece of paper and the X amount of clauses, and it might be that they contribute to some of the challenges. But if you apply your concept of value and rethinking about what is we're trying to achieve, that enables you to take a step back and say, actually, what is truly happening here? Is it a process thing? Is it a collaboration thing? How people that have to work together to get to the outcome are not working together. And so the contract as such is not necessarily the problem. It's a much broader organizational piece.
No, look, it's true. And I even have an example where actually, and it was quite funny because the external law firm actually did drive and actually opened a little bit the eyes, is that the contract itself is actually a thing that happens at the very end. It happens the moment that you almost say, look, but I'm kind of concluding in a very black and white thing. You would always say, look, we understand what we want to do, and now we write it quickly up and off we go. That's almost what it is, but that's also the reality. And we were prepared to do a big negotiation. So big negotiation teams, a lot of senior people in the law firm. I can tell you, we've been sitting there 2 weeks not looking at the contractual document because the external lawyer kind of got it that we were actually not ready for it. And so absolutely, the contract itself is very rarely the problem. I think that comes back to the previous conversations, that of course the dynamic around the clauses you negotiate, of course, makes that the contract at a certain moment becomes sometimes a problem. But ultimately, if people think that closing a deal is difficult because the contracting takes long, that's very rarely the real driver for the cycle of making a deal happen.
And I think also what you're highlighting is that the role that a contract plays within business ecosystem, within how the economics and transactions are done globally, they are almost underpinning, business relationships and business transactions. And so the business transaction is something that people can understand, the value, that has a value, but somehow we see it very separate from the contract that is actually an articulation and a reflection of that. And what you're saying, I think, needs to be one and the same, because then it drives your mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Because also, look, and even in my early days, definitely when we were in the Benelux, you have people who I would think, if I'm not a lawyer, I don't need to read a contract, for example. Yeah, look, if you want to do something, read the contract. And that doesn't mean that we ask people to be lawyers, all of them, but read the contract, because the contract gives you, I think you describe it in one of your blogs fairly well, as an operational guide, but I would even go one step further. It's almost use it, read it, because it's an inspiration of how you can execute it. It needs to be your peace of mind and your guide in execution. And if people think that there is a disconnect between the operation and the contract, then they're also completely wrong, of course.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Tomas, thank you so much for sharing your insights and extending this fantastic conversation in terms of the importance of contracts and the value that it plays within organizations. This was our second episode of Contractpreneurship. I'm Peggy Pauwels. I'm a partner at Deloitte Legal Management Consulting. And thank you for dialing in. Tomas, thank you very much again for sharing your insights. And until next time.
Thank you so much.